Barbara Wilson had spent most of her life navigating the complexities of legal language, bureaucracy, and high-pressure situations as a judicial translator. After decades of meticulously deciphering contracts, court rulings, and corporate agreements, she had finally stepped away from the relentless pace of her profession, ready to embrace a quieter, simpler life. At 64, she had no patience for nonsense, no tolerance for unnecessary drama, and certainly no interest in neighborhood politics. That was why she had been so deliberate when purchasing her home, a charming, modest brick house at the very edge of a suburban development, carefully chosen for its lack of restrictions, oversight, and most importantly, any ties to a homeowners association. She had always considered herself too independent for such organizations. The idea of paying a group of self-important committee members to dictate the height of her hedges or the color of her shutters was absurd. Her property was hers alone. She had done her research, double-checked the property records, and made sure that she was buying outside any mandatory associations before closing the deal. For a year, she had lived exactly as she had intended, peacefully, privately, without interference. It was exactly the kind of place she had dreamed of retiring to, close enough to town for convenience but far enough removed from the suffocating grip of neighborhood micromanagement. That was, until the letters started arriving. The first one came in a standard envelope, tucked among her usual stack of mail utility bills, bank statements, an invitation from the local library for a book club she had no interest in. The letter was formal, printed on thick, cream-colored paper, with the letterhead of the Oak Ridge Neighborhood Committee emblazoned across the top. The tone was cordial but firm, welcoming her as a valued resident and reminding her of her obligations to community standards. It outlined minor infractions. Her front yard had unauthorized vegetation, a few lavender bushes she had planted herself, and her mailbox was not in compliance with aesthetic guidelines. She had barely finished the first paragraph before scoffing and tossing it into the trash. It was a mistake, obviously. Some clerical error. But then the second letter came, and the third, and the fourth, each more insistent than the last. The warnings escalated, first a friendly reminder, then a notice of violation, and finally a statement that she had outstanding fees for non-compliance. The amount was laughable at first, a measly $75, but with every passing week it grew, creeping upward with penalties and administrative costs. One evening, curiosity got the better of her and she sifted through her kitchen trash to retrieve the latest notice, rereading the fine print. According to the committee, her property fell under their jurisdiction due to an expansion of neighborhood governance boundaries 2 years prior. That, she knew, was impossible. When she had bought her house, she had specifically checked for any association rules, and there had been none. Her patience snapped. Barbara was not the kind of woman to be bullied into compliance. She had spent too many years working with lawyers, navigating legal battles over property disputes and contractual loopholes. If these people thought they could intimidate her into paying fees she didn't owe, they had severely underestimated her. The next morning, she drove straight to the committee's office, a sterile little building nestled between a dry cleaner and a dentist's office in the small shopping center on the edge of town. Inside, the air smelled of printer ink and stale coffee. A bored-looking receptionist barely glanced up from her computer as Barbara approached the counter. "I need to speak to whoever's in charge of these notices," Barbara said, sliding the most recent letter across the desk. The receptionist picked it up with a slow blink, barely skimming the text. "You have a compliance issue." "No," Barbara said flatly. "I have an issue with you sending me fraudulent demands for money." That, at least, got the receptionist's attention. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard before she pursed her lips and motioned toward the hallway. "Mr. Price handles resident concerns. Third door on the left." Barbara didn't wait for an invitation. She strode down the hall, knocking once before pushing open the door. Graham Price was exactly the kind of man she had expected, mid-50s, sharp suit, the kind of polite but condescending smile that made her skin crawl. He gestured toward the chair opposite his desk as if he were doing her a favor. "Mrs. Wilson," he greeted, clasping his hands together. "What can I do for you?" "You can explain why I keep receiving invoices for fees I don't owe," she said, dropping the letter onto his desk. Price barely looked at it. I assume you've read the documentation. Your property is within the Oak Ridge Governance Zone, which means... No, it isn't. She cut him off. I checked when I bought the house. There was no association tied to my property. Price exhaled through his nose, tilting his head in a way that suggested he found her amusing. The bylaws were updated 2 years ago. Any residence within the expanded zoning district is automatically included, without consent. There was a vote. I wasn't here 2 years ago. The vote passed by majority. As a property owner, you are now required to comply with. No, I'm not. Price's smile stiffened. Barbara leaned forward, voice like steel. I am not a member of your association. I did not sign any agreement, and I will not be paying a cent. This is harassment. A long silence stretched between them. Then Price chuckled, shaking his head. Mrs. Wilson, he said, tapping his fingers on the desk. I understand this might seem frustrating, but the reality is we are responsible for maintaining the quality and value of this community. The rules are in place to protect homeowners, yourself included. I don't need your protection. He sighed, glancing at the papers stacked neatly on his desk before finally meeting her gaze. I would strongly encourage you to reconsider your stance. It would be easier for everyone involved. A threat. Barbara had seen enough corporate power plays in her life to recognize one. She stood, straightening her shoulders. This conversation is over. She turned and left without another word. When she arrived home, the first thing she noticed was the sign. It hadn't been there when she left that morning, but now, staked into her front lawn, was a large wooden post bearing a white placard with bold black letters. Notice of violation. Property in non-compliance. She stared at it for a long moment, feeling the slow coil of anger tighten in her chest. They wanted a fight? They had no idea who they were dealing with. Barbara stood in her front yard, staring at the sign planted in her grass as if it were some kind of joke. It was an official-looking thing, with the same pretentious font and self-important wording as the letters she'd been receiving, a statement of authority meant to intimidate her into submission. The audacity of it, the sheer arrogance of walking onto her property and staking their claim in broad daylight, was almost impressive. Almost. What they hadn't counted on was that she was not the kind of woman to roll over and accept nonsense. She didn't touch the sign at first. She simply turned on her heel, walked up the porch steps, and went inside to retrieve her phone. If these people thought they could impose their will on her with laminated warnings and empty threats, they had sorely underestimated her patience. She dialed the number from the last notice and let it ring, arms crossed as she watched through her front window, half expecting someone to skulk by and check if their little intimidation tactic had worked. Good afternoon, Oak Ridge Neighborhood Committee. This is Marissa speaking. How can I assist you? Barbara didn't bother with pleasantries. I need someone to explain to me why I have a violation notice on my property when I am not a member of your association. There was a pause, just long enough to suggest that Marissa had either dealt with calls like this before or had been warned that Barbara might become a problem. I'm sorry, Ma, but if there's a notice on your property, it means your home falls within our jurisdiction. If you have questions about compliance, I can direct you to our... I don't have questions about compliance, Barbara interrupted. I have questions about trespassing. Someone from your office stepped onto my land without permission and left a sign as if they have any legal authority over my home. They don't. So unless you want to add unlawful entry to whatever fraudulent billing scheme you people are running, I suggest you send someone to remove it. Immediately. A beat of silence. Then a soft exhale. Let me transfer you to our enforcement officer. Barbara smirked. Enforcement. As if they were running a police force rather than a glorified neighborhood watch. There was a click, then another line ringing. It picked up faster than she expected. This is Graham Price. She didn't hesitate. You've crossed the line. Mrs. Wilson, Price said smoothly, his voice carrying that same practiced patience he'd used during their meeting. I was hoping to hear from you. Have you reconsidered your stance on? Spare me the sales pitch. I want the sign gone. And I want an explanation for why someone from your office thinks they have the right to step onto my property. Mrs. Wilson, we have the full legal authority to enforce compliance with. No, you don't, she cut him off, her grip tightening around the phone. We both know you don't. But let's entertain this ridiculous idea for a second. Let's say I was a member of your little club. That would mean I'd have agreed to a contract, right? That I signed something, somewhere, that explicitly outlined these supposed obligations. So go ahead, Price. Send me a copy of my signed agreement. There was a pause, just a fraction of hesitation. Not much, but enough for her to know she had him. I don't have that in front of me at the moment, he said finally, the faintest trace of annoyance seeping into his tone. No kidding. Because it doesn't exist, she exhaled sharply. Take down the sign, Price. I'm afraid that's not possible. Barbara had half expected that answer, but it still set her teeth on edge. Then I'll take it down myself. Doing so would be considered destruction of association property. Barbara nearly laughed at the absurdity of it. It's on my land, which is now subject to our community standards. Let me make myself clear. She could feel the slow, simmering anger pooling in her chest. If that sign is still there by the end of the day, I'll be filing a trespassing report with the sheriff's office. If I see anyone from your office step foot on my property again, I'll have them arrested. A long silence. Then Price sighed, as if he were the patient teacher dealing with an unruly student. I see you're intent on being difficult about this. Barbara smiled. You have no idea. She hung up before he could get another word in. She went outside, marched across her lawn, and yanked the sign out of the ground in one swift motion. If Price had a problem with it, he could take it up with someone who cared. For a moment, she thought that was the end of it. She was wrong. That night, just past midnight, she was woken by the sound of something scraping against her driveway. Not loud, not obvious, just a faint, deliberate movement that didn't belong to the usual noises of the neighborhood. She sat up, listening. Another scrape, followed by a dull thud. She slipped out of bed, moving to the window. At first, she saw nothing. The street was quiet, the dim glow of a few porch lights flickering across empty driveways. But then, a shadow moved just at the edge of her property. Two figures, both dressed in dark clothing, crouched near her front gate. One was pressing something into the grass, the other holding a clipboard. Her pulse spiked. Without a second thought, she grabbed her phone and dialed 911. The dispatcher picked up immediately. 911, what's your emergency? There are two men on my property, possibly trespassing. She kept her voice level, watching as one of the figures stood. They're planting something in my yard. Can you describe them? Dark clothing. One of them has a clipboard. They're working fast, like they don't want to be seen. A pause. Are they armed? Not that I can see, but I'm not stepping outside to check. We're sending a unit to your location. Stay inside and do not engage. Barbara had no intention of engaging. She simply stood at the window, phone gripped tight, watching as the figures seemed to hesitate. Maybe they had seen her light turn on, or maybe they just knew they were running out of time. Either way, within seconds, they were moving, hurrying back toward the sidewalk before disappearing into a dark SUV parked a few houses down. 2 minutes later, red and blue lights washed over the street. Barbara stepped onto her porch as two officers exited their patrol car. She gestured toward her yard. They were just there. One of the officers scanned the area with a flashlight, sweeping the beam over the grass. Then he frowned and motioned her forward. "Ma-am, you should see this." She stepped closer, peering down. A fresh notice of violation had been staked into her lawn. And underneath it, scattered in the dirt, were photographs of her house, taken from multiple angles, some during the day, some at night. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't about fees. This wasn't about compliance. They were watching her. Barbara had spent most of her adult life keeping her emotions in check, refining the art of composure, ensuring that logic always outweighed impulse. It was a skill that had served her well in courtrooms and negotiation rooms alike, a practiced ability to see through deception, to cut through posturing and intimidation tactics, to remain unmoved even when the other party resorted to theatrics. But as she stood in her yard in the dim glow of the patrol car's headlights, staring down at the scattered photographs of her own home, she felt something unfamiliar rise inside her, something raw, unsettled, and cold. The officers were speaking, asking her if she had noticed anything unusual in the past few weeks, if she had reason to believe she was being targeted. Of course she had. Of course she was. But standing there, taking in the sheer audacity of what had just happened, she found herself momentarily at a loss for words. The violation notice, the silent intrusion, the photographs taken without her knowledge, it wasn't just intimidation anymore. It was surveillance. And that changed everything. She inhaled sharply, forcing herself to focus. "I need to file a formal report," she said, her voice steady but sharp. "Trespassing, harassment, targeted surveillance, whoever these people are, they are escalating." The officers exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them. One of them, a younger man with a badge that read Officer Rains, nodded. "We'll start with your statement and process the evidence. Do you have security cameras on the property?" Barbara exhaled through her nose. She had always relied on the fact that her property was far enough from the main road to deter prying eyes, that the large oak trees lining the edge of her lot provided privacy. But privacy wasn't security, and she had let herself believe she was safe without taking the necessary precautions. That was a mistake she would not make again. "No, but that's about to change," she said. The officers took their time collecting the photographs, carefully placing them in evidence bags before moving to the stake in the ground. The notice was almost identical to the one she had ripped out earlier that day, but this time the wording was even more insistent: "Final warning, non-compliance will result in legal action." It was a bluff. She knew it was a bluff. But the difference between an empty threat and an effective one was simple persistence. If you pushed someone long enough, hard enough, without backing down, eventually they started to doubt themselves. That was the tactic at play here. The committee wasn't relying on legal grounds or proper protocol, they were relying on exhaustion. They were waiting for her to break. She had no intention of doing so. After filing her statement with the officers and locking up the house for the night, Barbara did not sleep. Instead, she made a list. By morning, she had a plan. The first step was securing her home. She drove into town the next day and purchased a full surveillance system, motion-activated floodlights, cameras with remote access, and a reinforced deadbolt for the back gate. It took her hours to install everything, longer than she expected, but by the time the sun set that evening, her property was under constant watch. The second step was going back to the records. If the committee claimed her property had been annexed into their jurisdiction, then there had to be documentation, legal paperwork, zoning adjustments, something beyond their empty threats. She went straight to the county records office, where a tired-looking clerk raised an eyebrow at her request but nonetheless directed her to a workstation. It took hours of searching through digital files and paper archives, but eventually she found what she was looking for. 2 years ago, the Oak Ridge Committee had filed a request to expand their jurisdiction, a formal appeal to the county to absorb additional properties into their oversight. The language was vague, the justification weak, citing the need for consistent community standards and maintenance responsibilities, but what stood out the most was the approval signature: Graham Price. Of course it was him. But the real problem wasn't the request itself. It was the fine print. Most expansion requests required property owner consent, signed agreements confirming that residents agreed to the change. But in this case, there were no signatures, no evidence that anyone had formally agreed to be absorbed into the committee's governance. Instead, there was a single line of legalese buried deep within the document that claimed the committee had the right to enforce retroactive compliance under assumed consent, unless explicitly contested within a specific time frame. Barbara's stomach twisted as she checked the date. That time frame had expired 8 months before she had even moved in. Her property had been claimed without her knowledge before she had even signed the deed. She sat back in her chair, exhaling slowly. They had known. Price, the committee, whoever else was pulling the strings, they had known exactly what they were doing. They had waited. Waited for a new owner to take possession of the house, banking on the assumption that whoever it was wouldn't notice the fine print, wouldn't push back, wouldn't make it their mission to dig into the deception. Too bad for them. Barbara wasn't just going to push back. She was going to burn their entire scheme to the ground. She printed every relevant document, compiling them into a file thick enough to drop with a satisfying thud on the records desk before heading straight to her attorney's office. David Lane was not a man known for his patience, nor was he someone who had ever backed down from a fight, which made him the perfect person to handle this mess. He listened intently as Barbara laid out the situation, flipping through the documents with the detached focus of someone already planning how to dismantle the opposition. "So, to be clear," he said, finally setting the papers aside, "they annexed your property under a policy that assumes consent unless explicitly denied, but you weren't given the opportunity to deny it because it happened before you purchased the home." "Exactly. And now they're using that loophole to harass you into compliance. That, and whatever else they think they can get away with." David nodded, lacing his fingers together. "You said the police have already been involved." "They took my report, but I doubt they'll do much unless things escalate further." "They will," David said flatly. "These people don't stop. They double down." Barbara had come to the same conclusion. David leaned back, studying her for a long moment. "I'll draft a formal cease and desist. We'll hit them with a legal challenge on jurisdictional overreach and fraudulent enforcement. If they push back, we'll take it to court." Barbara nodded. Then he smiled, sharp and knowing. "And if they really want to play hardball, we'll start digging into their financials." Barbara exhaled slowly. Good she left his office feeling steadier, but the moment she pulled into her driveway, her breath hitched. Her mailbox was gone. Not damaged. Not vandalized. Gone. The post had been ripped straight out of the ground, leaving nothing but a gaping hole in the dirt. She stepped out of the car, a slow, simmering anger crawling up her spine. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. This was war. Barbara stared at the empty space where her mailbox had stood, a hollow pit forming in her chest as the reality of the situation settled in. They weren't just playing games anymore. This was direct, calculated escalation. A clear message: we can reach you. We can make things disappear. And there's nothing you can do about it. But they were wrong. She took a slow breath, forcing herself to think rather than react. If she called the police again, would they even take it seriously? They had already taken her previous report, but nothing had come of it. And as long as the committee could hide behind paperwork and fake violations, law enforcement would hesitate to intervene. It was time to change the approach. Instead of dialing the police, she took out her phone and scrolled to David Lane's number. He picked up after 2 rings, his voice sharp and alert even though it was barely past sunrise. "Talk to me." "They took my mailbox," she said evenly, still staring at the exposed earth where the post had been yanked from the ground. "Not vandalized. Gone." A pause. Then, the sound of papers shuffling. "That was faster than I expected." "You expected this." "I expected them to test your resolve. The question is, what's the next move?" Barbara exhaled, turning back toward her house, the morning air crisp against her skin. "I need proof. More than just letters and warnings. I need to catch them in the act." David's chair creaked on the other end of the line. "Good. Then let's set a trap." A new mailbox was in place the same day, but this time it was reinforced, bolted into a concrete base with a hidden security camera mounted just inside the frame. Motion activated, high resolution, with a live feed accessible from her phone. If they came back, she would see them. And then there would be no deniability. She spent the rest of the day installing additional cameras around her property. Every angle covered, every vulnerable point secured. She wasn't just documenting harassment anymore, she was preparing for the moment they made a mistake. And they would. That night she barely slept. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, ears attuned to every noise outside. The rustling of tree branches in the wind. The distant hum of a passing car. The quiet, mechanical click of her camera switching to night mode. Her phone vibrated against the nightstand. She reached for it immediately, pulse spiking. The alert was from the mailbox camera. Motion detected. Her fingers moved fast, opening the live feed. The screen was grainy in the dim light, but the image was unmistakable: two figures standing near her mailbox. One holding a crowbar. The other scanning the street, acting as lookout. She sat up, her mind calculating a dozen possibilities at once. She could go outside, make her presence known, force them to retreat. She could call the police, but by the time they arrived, these bastards would be gone. Or she could let them finish what they came to do, let them rip the mailbox out of the ground again, knowing that this time she had them on camera. She watched in silence as the man with the crowbar jammed the tool under the base of the post, heaving his weight against it. The metal groaned. The lookout shifted, glancing up toward her house, hesitating for a fraction of a second. Then his head snapped toward the driveway. Barbara's headlights flooded the yard as she threw her car into reverse, tires kicking up gravel as she shot out of the garage at full speed. The men froze for half a second before bolting. The lookout sprinted toward a waiting car at the end of the block, while the one with the crowbar stumbled, cursing as he abandoned his tool and lunged after him. Barbara floored it, aiming straight for their escape route, swerving just in time to block the street before they could peel away. The driver slammed on the brakes, barely stopping in time, headlights glaring through her windshield. For a split second, everything held still. Then the passenger door flew open, and the lookout bailed, darting into the darkness between houses. The car jerked back, tires screeching as the driver reversed down the street at breakneck speed, disappearing around the corner before she could make out the plates. Barbara exhaled through clenched teeth, her hands gripping the steering wheel. She was shaking, adrenaline spiking through her veins, but the fear was gone. She had won this round. By the time the police arrived, she was waiting on her porch, arms crossed, watching as the officers retrieved the abandoned crowbar and took her statement. This time she had everything: video footage, timestamps, clear images of the men's faces. It wasn't just harassment anymore. It was attempted destruction of private property, criminal trespass, and conspiracy. David called her the next morning, his tone somewhere between impressed and exasperated. "Tell me you didn't chase them in your car." "I didn't chase them," Barbara said. "I made an aggressive parking decision." He sighed. "The footage is solid. We'll push for formal charges, but don't expect them to get jail time. These kinds of people are slippery. They'll deny involvement, claim mistaken identity, anything to avoid consequences. They won't get the chance." David hesitated. "What does that mean?" Barbara glanced at her laptop, the emails she had queued up, the complaints she was preparing to submit to every relevant agency she could find. "It means I'm not just waiting for them to slip up. I'm going on the offensive." She had filed 3 formal complaints, one with the county zoning board, one with the Attorney General's office, and one with the state commission overseeing community governance. Every document she had, every contradiction in their paperwork, every violation of due process. And then she sent an email directly to Graham Price. Subject: "You've made a mistake. Graham. I assume by now you've been informed of the incident last night. You should also know that the individuals involved were recorded in full detail, and I have already submitted the footage to law enforcement. Additionally, I have formally requested a review of Oak Ridge's expansion policies, including the lack of documented property owner consent. If I do not receive an immediate cease and desist regarding all enforcement attempts on my property, I will pursue legal action not only against the committee but against you personally. Your move." Barbara Wilson. She hit send and leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. The fight was no longer about a mailbox. It wasn't even about her property. It was about power. And she was done playing defense. Barbara had expected retaliation. She had spent too many years working alongside lawyers, untangling bureaucratic webs, watching corporations and organizations twist rules to their advantage, to believe that her formal complaints and legal threats would be enough to stop them. The people behind this weren't used to being challenged. They were used to compliance, to neighbors folding under pressure, to the kind of quiet submission that let them operate unchecked. She had no doubt that Graham Price had received her email. She had no doubt that he had read it, stewed over it, recognized it for what it was: a declaration of war. but what she hadn't expected was just how quickly they would move. The next morning, she woke to the sound of something slamming against her front porch. The impact rattled the windows, a deep, echoing thud that sent a jolt of adrenaline through her chest. She was on her feet in seconds, reaching for the phone on her nightstand as she crossed the room, pulling back the curtain just enough to see outside. A thick envelope lay sprawled on the wooden planks of her porch. No delivery truck, no mail carrier in sight. Whoever had left it had done so quietly, without announcement, without hesitation. Barbara opened the door cautiously, the cool morning air biting at her skin as she stepped outside. She crouched down, picking up the envelope, her fingers brushing against the raised lettering of the Oak Ridge Committee's official seal. She already knew what it was before she even opened it. Notice of legal action. The words stared back at her in bold, unforgiving print, an unmistakable declaration. Cease and desist notice for harassment and defamation. A formal warning that her recent actions, her complaints, her refusal to comply, her involvement of external agencies constituted a disruptive influence on the integrity of the community. Attached were accusations, carefully worded but dripping with veiled hostility, implying that her conduct had created an atmosphere of hostility and that multiple residents had filed complaints against her behavior. It was a trap. A calculated move designed to flip the narrative, to frame her as the aggressor, to lay the groundwork for what would come next. She had seen it before, in different forms, different contexts, but the strategy was always the same. If you couldn't intimidate someone into submission, you isolated them, painted them as a problem, made them the villain. Barbara exhaled sharply, gripping the papers tighter. They wanted her gone. She scanned the fine print, searching for the legal foundation they were trying to use against her. The notice referenced community bylaws, but it was vague, deliberately so. No direct citation of statutes, no clear precedent. That meant they were bluffing, banking on her not wanting to go through the exhausting process of fighting back. They didn't know who they were dealing with. She gathered every document she had, every email, every record of their violations, every piece of evidence that contradicted their claims, and drove straight to David Lane's office. She didn't call ahead. She didn't need to. When she walked in, he took one look at her expression and gestured for her to close the door behind her. They hit back, she said, dropping the envelope onto his desk. David picked it up, flipping through the pages, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to something colder. He let out a quiet scoff. They're trying to paint you as the problem. They don't have a case. No, but they don't need one, he said, setting the papers down. This isn't about winning in court. This is about applying pressure. They're betting that you'll back down before it ever gets that far. Barbara met his gaze. You know that's not going to happen. A slow smile tugged at the corner of David's mouth. I was hoping you'd say that. He leaned back in his chair, considering. All right, we counter with a wrongful harassment claim. We bring in third-party property auditors to examine their zoning expansions. If we can prove any inconsistency, any manipulation of district lines, any misappropriation of funds, we put them on the defensive. Barbara nodded. And if that's not enough, then we escalate. And escalate it did. By the end of the week, Barbara was served with 3 additional violation notices, one for unauthorized security installations, her cameras, one for excessive obstruction of public easements, her own driveway, and one for failure to maintain property aesthetics. A non-existent issue fabricated solely to add weight to their claims. Each notice came with a fine. Each fine was significantly higher than the last. The intimidation tactics weren't just legal either. The first time she caught someone lingering outside her house, she convinced herself it was coincidence. The second time, when the same car passed her property 3 times in one afternoon, she started keeping a list. By the third time, when she stepped outside and locked eyes with a man sitting in a dark sedan parked just beyond her property line, she was already dialing David. They're watching me, she said without preamble. David didn't sound surprised. They're making you a target. They want you rattled. Barbara exhaled, running a hand through her hair. It's not working. Good. Because we're about to push them harder than they've ever been pushed. The next day, She filed her own lawsuit, a formal demand for financial transparency, an audit of the committee's practices, a legal injunction against their continued harassment. She wasn't just refusing to back down. She was forcing them into a fight they weren't prepared for. And it was working. The committee's responses became frantic, more aggressive, more desperate. They started pressuring her neighbors, knocking on doors, spinning the narrative that Barbara was bringing unnecessary trouble to the community. Some neighbors avoided her entirely. Others whispered warnings when no one was looking. But then the escalation took a new form. Barbara returned home one evening to find her garage door partially open. The lock had been broken. Her pulse spiked. She stepped inside cautiously, heart pounding as she scanned the dimly lit space. Nothing looked disturbed at first. No shattered glass, no overturned shelves. But then her eyes landed on the workbench against the far wall, where her security monitor had been ripped from the cables. Not stolen. Destroyed. A message. Barbara clenched her jaw, her fingers tightening into fists. They wanted her scared. They wanted her to hesitate, to rethink how far she was willing to go. Instead, she picked up her phone and dialed David. They broke into my garage silence. Then, his voice, low and steady. "I'll handle it the next morning." Barbara woke to the sound of police at her doorstep. Not because she had called them. Because David had. And this time they weren't just taking a report. They were building a criminal case. And Oak Ridge was running out of time. Barbara had spent the past few weeks preparing for this moment, for the inevitable breaking point where the committee would make a mistake big enough to bury them. The signs had been there for days, their increasing desperation, the clumsy attempts to shift blame, the reckless push to silence her by whatever means necessary. They weren't careful anymore. They were spiraling. And when people like Graham Price started spiraling, they became sloppy. The break-in had been the final straw. David had wasted no time in turning it into something bigger, using the destruction of property to escalate the legal battle from a civil dispute into a full-fledged criminal investigation. That changed everything. It meant law enforcement was now forced to take action. No more half-hearted reports. No more ignored complaints. This wasn't just about harassment anymore. It was about targeted intimidation, illegal surveillance, and organized misconduct. Barbara sat in David's office, her hands resting on the thick folders spread across the desk between them. It was filled with evidence, timestamps, footage, documented threats, reports from the financial auditors who had started digging into Oak Ridge's ledgers at her request. What they had found wasn't just suspicious. It was damning. They'd been embezzling for years, David said, flipping through the latest audit summary. Overcharging residents for maintenance fees that never went to actual maintenance, redirecting funds to off-the-books accounts, and that zoning expansion they pushed through. He tapped one of the pages. They manipulated property boundaries without approval, submitted altered documents to the county, and then used those fake maps to pressure homeowners into compliance. Barbara exhaled slowly. So they knew from the beginning that they had no authority over my property. David nodded. They knew, and when you refused to fall in line, they decided to make an example out of you. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed still sent a cold pulse of anger through her veins. She had been a target, not because she had done anything wrong, but because she had been too difficult to control. And if they had gotten away with it before, how many other homeowners had they bullied into submission? How many had been coerced into paying fraudulent fines, too exhausted or afraid to fight back? David leaned back, watching her carefully. "You know what happens next, right?" Barbara met his gaze. "We take them down." That night, she barely slept. She sat at her kitchen table, the weight of everything pressing down on her, the reality of what she was about to do settling in. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was bigger than that. She had started this fight to protect her own home, but now she was about to expose something much larger, something that could rip apart the foundation of Oak Ridge itself. The next morning, she arrived at the county courthouse with David at her side. She had expected some pushback, maybe a delay in getting a judge to hear their emergency injunction, but the moment the clerk at the filing desk saw David's credentials, things moved fast. Within hours, the county had approved an immediate review of Oak Ridge's zoning practices, which meant all enforcement actions taken under the fraudulent jurisdiction were now legally suspended. Barbara wasn't the only one who got the news. She was back home by noon when a sleek black SUV rolled up to her driveway. She didn't need to see the driver to know who it was. She stepped onto her porch, arms crossed, as Graham Price climbed out of the vehicle, his suit crisp, his expression tight. "You just couldn't let this go? Could you?" he said, his voice even, but she could hear the strain underneath. Barbara tilted her head. "You trespassed on my property. You filed false claims. You tried to have me arrested for rules that don't exist. What exactly did you think was going to happen?" Price exhaled sharply, his hands tightening at his sides. "You think you've won something here, but you don't understand how this works. You've made enemies in places you don't even realize exist." Barbara raised an eyebrow. "Is that a threat, Price?" For a moment there was nothing but silence between them. A thinly veiled moment of tension, the last vestige of control Price thought he still had. But then, as if realizing that he had already lost, he simply shook his head. "You think this is over, but it's not." Barbara smiled. "No, it's not. Because now the county is investigating everything you've done, and when they're done with you, you won't have anything left to stand on." She turned and walked back inside without another word, shutting the door behind her. An hour later, the first news reports broke. David had leaked the financial records, the fraudulent zoning maps, the growing list of legal violations tied directly to Graham Price and the Oak Ridge Committee. It spread fast. Local stations picked it up, and within days, more residents started coming forward with their own stories, their own records of years of wrongful fines, harassment, and forced compliance under fabricated regulations. By the end of the week, the county had frozen Oak Ridge's accounts. By the end of the month, Price had resigned under investigation. Barbara had spent weeks bracing for the next attack, waiting for them to regroup, to retaliate in some new, desperate way. But no one came. No more letters. No more fines. No more cars idling outside her home. For the first time in months, it was quiet. The morning after Price's resignation, Barbara stepped outside, coffee in hand, and walked to the end of her driveway. The sun was bright, the air crisp, the street lined with the quiet hum of a neighborhood moving on. Her mailbox was still there. And for the first time since this all started, she knew it always would be. Barbara had expected victory to feel more immediate, more dramatic, like the final swing of a gavel in a packed courtroom or the flash of a camera capturing Graham Price being led away in handcuffs. But real justice, the kind that wasn't orchestrated for spectacle, moved slower, more methodically. It took weeks for the full weight of the investigation to settle in, for the lawsuits to be processed, for the Oak Ridge Committee to start unraveling thread by thread. Some residents tried to defend Price, claiming that the community had needed strong leadership, and that his actions had been misunderstood. But as more financial records surfaced, as more homeowners realized how much money had been siphoned away under the guise of maintenance fees and beautification projects that never materialized, the tide turned. Barbara had spent so long in a constant state of defense, preparing for the next move, the next violation notice, the next fabricated complaint, that when it all stopped, she didn't quite know how to process it. There were no more letters in the mail, no more cars idling at the end of her street, no more knocks on her door from people trying to convince her she was the problem. She had won, but there was no rush of triumph, no cinematic moment of closure. Just a quiet absence, the slow realization that she was free of them, that they had no more control over her or her property. The final blow to Oak Ridge came when the county officially revoked their zoning authority, ruling that the boundary expansion had been illegally manipulated to include properties that were never meant to be under their control. That ruling alone was enough to invalidate years of fines, fees, and foreclosures, forcing the committee into a corner. Homeowners who had been paying into the system for years started demanding refunds, and with Oak Ridge's bank accounts already frozen due to the fraud investigation, they had no way to pay them back. One by one, committee members started resigning, distancing themselves from the wreckage, until only a handful of diehards remained, clinging to the belief that if they just fought harder, they could still salvage their power. But they couldn't. By the time Graham Price was officially charged with fraud and falsification of records, Oak Ridge was functionally dead. The county had stepped in, taking over what few legitimate responsibilities the committee had handled: garbage collection, road maintenance, public works, leaving nothing behind except the name. Barbara had no interest in the aftermath beyond what was necessary. She wasn't the type to gloat, to show up at town meetings and revel in their downfall. She didn't need to. The truth had done its work, and that was enough. But she did keep track of one thing: the lawsuit she had filed against Price personally. She had known from the start that taking on the Oak Ridge Committee was one thing, but making sure Price himself paid for what he had done was another. Committees dissolved, bureaucracies shifted, but individuals could be held accountable. She had sued for damages, legal fees, emotional distress, property devaluation due to fraudulent claims. It was a battle in and of itself, one that dragged on even as Oak Ridge collapsed. Price tried to fight it, tried to argue that she was the aggressor, that she had targeted him, that this was all a personal vendetta. But the evidence didn't lie. The fraudulent documents, the falsified zoning records, the harassment tactics, the intimidation, it was all there, indisputable, undeniable. In the end, the court ruled in her favor. The settlement wasn't extravagant enough to cover her legal costs, enough to replace what she had lost, enough to make it sting for Price. But that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that he hadn't escaped. What mattered was that he had been forced to face consequences. When it was all over, Barbara went back to living the life she had wanted when she first moved to Oak Ridge. Her days were quiet, filled with the kind of peace she had fought so hard to reclaim. She spent mornings tending to her garden, afternoons reading on her porch, evenings cooking meals without worrying about what new violation notice might arrive the next day. She didn't think much about Oak Ridge anymore, except when she walked to her mailbox, a small, reinforced reminder that no one would ever try to take it from her again. One day, months after everything had settled, she received a letter. Not from a committee, not from a lawyer, but from a neighbor. A handwritten note, neat cursive on thick paper. Barbara, I never said this before, but thank you. I should have stood up sooner. We all should have. I hope you know how much you changed things for all of us. There was no signature. Just a quiet acknowledgement from someone who had watched from the sidelines, someone who had been afraid, someone who had only found their voice after the fight was already over. Barbara read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and set it aside. She didn't need recognition. She didn't need gratitude. She just needed the silence of a home that was finally truly hers.